On August 26, 1928, a man named Carl Panzram was arrested in Larchmont, New York. "I'm not sorry." That's what he said. After claiming to have assaulted over 1,000 men, he burned churches, he robbed homes. He escaped from prison time and time again, and under oath, he declared that if he had the chance, he would kill every man, woman, and child on earth. He never asked for forgiveness. He never even flinched. "I do not believe in man, God, nor devil. I hate the whole damn human race, including myself." Carl Panzram was not just a killer. He was a void, a black hole of conscience, drifting through the world untouched by guilt, untamed by fear. How does a human being lose the thing that separates us from beasts? Emotion, empathy, the ability to feel anything at all. How was that void created? How did it drive him? And why could nothing, not punishment, not compassion, not even death, ever reach him again? This is Carl Panzram, America's most emotionally numb killer. Childhood as destruction. Carl Panzram was not born evil, but he was born into a life that seemed determined to destroy anything good in him. He was born on June 28, 1891, in East Grand Forks, Minnesota, the youngest of 6 children in a poor immigrant family from Prussia. His parents came to America chasing opportunity. What they found was poverty. His father, John, was a former soldier, an abusive alcoholic, and a religious fanatic. He regularly beat his children under the guise of discipline, until one day, he left. His mother, Matilda Lizzie, was older, emotionally fragile, and physically exhausted. She suffered from depression and menopause, and often left baby Carl unattended, crying in a cold farmhouse while she tried to keep the family alive. By age 5, Carl had already begun lying, stealing, and drinking. At age 8, he was arrested for public drunkenness. By age 10, he was labeled incorrigible. At 11, he broke into a neighbor's home, stole food, and found a revolver. The system responded by sending him to the Minnesota State Training School, a reform institution for problem children, aged 7 to 21. It was here that Carl said he learned about the cruelty of man to man. Carl was whipped with leather straps while salt water, soaked towels were placed on his back to maximize pain and minimize marks. There was even a mechanical spanking machine which was called Ormaquina de Nalgadas. And built by staff to automate corporal punishment, he was stripped naked, tied face down on a bench, and lashed up to 30 times. And then, they made him pray, morning prayers, pre-meal prayers, prayers before bed. This was not religion. This was control designed to break the will. And it really worked. Carl was repeatedly sexually abused at the school, by both supervisors and older boys. He later described the place not as a school, but as a factory that manufactured pain and obedience. And he wasn't alone. How many other boys were chewed up and discarded in places like this, with no one to remember them? Carl responded the only way he knew how, with rage. He began to urinate and masturbate into food served to other boys. He attempted to poison a staff member with rat poison. On July 2, 1995, set fire to the paint shop, the building where most beatings took place. No one ever caught him. Carl learned something powerful. Pretending to be good worked better than actually trying to be. He began to fake repentance, claim religious conversion, and smile for the sty had discovered manipulation. And he liked it. But inside, he was unraveling. At age 9, Carl had suffered from a serious middle ear infection that spread to the mastoid bone. His mother, too poor to seek medical care, performed a crude surgery at home without anesthesia or sterilization. The infection may have reached his hypothalamus, a brain region that controls emotion, aggression, and impulse. Some experts believe this neurological trauma amplified his inability to feel remorse or regulate rage. That would only be compounded after his release. Not long after escaping the school, Carl hitched a ride on a freight train. Inside a straw-filled boxcar, he was gang-raped by a group of hobos. Just days later, it happened again, with a different group. This wasn't just violence. It was the final blow to whatever innocence remained. He later wrote, "My innocence was murdered. From then on, I would become a destroyer of others." Carl's first major psychological declaration came soon after. "If I couldn't hurt those who hurt me, I would hurt someone else." And he did. How he used his numbness. After escaping from the Minnesota State Training School, Carl didn't seek healing or redemption. He once wrote, "I couldn't hurt the ones who hurt me, I would hurt anyone else." And that's exactly what he did. Carl didn't kill for money. He didn't kill out of lust. He killed for power and revenge. His victims were random, often nameless, and always powerless. He didn't want their belongings. He wanted their dignity, because that's what had been taken from him. In the train cars of America, he found easy prey. Drifters, hobos, desperate men. Carl assaulted them, humiliated them, and sometimes at gunpoint, forced them to violate each other. In one case, he raped a railroad security guard and made another homeless man do the same, just to prove he could. But his violence didn't stop at the personal level. Carl also dreamed of destruction on a mass scale. He once planned to poison the water supply of an entire city using arsenic. In another moment of delusional ambition, he considered hijacking a British naval vessel to provoke a war between England and the United States. These weren't just impulsive thoughts, they were blueprints for mass death. Then came the Akista, a yacht he purchased using money stolen from the home of former President William Taft. Panzram sailed up and down the East Coast, inviting sailors aboard with offers of food and work. Once at sea, he'd get them drunk, sexually assault them, shoot them with his Colt .45 and dump their bodies overboard. 10 men died this way. When asked why, he said it was his personal solution to the human problem. His cruelty wasn't confined to the U.S. While working in Angola, Africa, Panzram murdered a young boy, just 11 years old. He later described the act with brutal detachment. His brain was coming out of his ears. He was never more dead. Days later, he shot and killed 6 boatmen he had hired, then fed their corpses to crocodiles. Panzram also set fire to buildings, ships, churches, and even prisons. Not to destroy evidence, but to destroy for destruction's sake. Violence wasn't just a habit, it was his identity. He once wrote, "And I don't regret it, I liked it. Every act of brutality was a moment where he felt most alive." There was no fear, no guilt, just force. In 1928, he reached a new level of moral collapse. That summer, he murdered 3 boys across the northeastern United States. The first one was George Henry McMahon, age 12, in Salem, Massachusetts. He was beaten to death with a rock. The second one was Alexander Lazar, age 14, in Philadelphia. He was strangled with a leather belt. The last one was an unnamed boy in New Haven. He was assaulted, then murdered. Carl Panzram's life also went long descent into deeper prisons. He entered his first prison as a teenager and never truly left the cycle of confinement, rebellion, and retribution. At the age of 15, under the alias Jeff Davis, Carl enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1907. Within months, he was caught stealing property, guns, uniforms, and supplies from Fort William Taft. He was convicted by court-martial and sentenced to 2 years at Fort Leavenworth, a military prison in Kansas known for its brutal conditions. This was his first real imprisonment. In 1915, Carl was arrested in Oregon for burglarizing a home and was sentenced to 7 years at the Oregon State Penitentiary. But within those walls, he hardened. He escaped twice, once in 1917 with an inmate named Otto Hooker, who later shot and killed the prison warden Harry Minta during their pursuit. Carl was recaptured, placed in solitary confinement for 61 days, and eventually escaped once more. Over the next decade, Carl drifted across the United States, using false names like Jack Allen, John O'Leary, and Jeff Rhodes, racking up arrests in Texas, New Mexico, Montana, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. He was jailed in numerous local facilities for theft, carrying illegal weapons, forgery, and impersonation. Many of these stints lasted a few months to 2 years, and he escaped more than once by deceiving authorities with new identities. The killer's surrender. On August 26, 1928, in the quiet town of Larchmont, New York, Carl broke into a train station, hoping to steal supplies. He was caught red-handed. What shocked the police wasn't the break in itself, it was that he didn't resist. He was carrying a firearm, false identification, and using an alias. But none of that compared to what came next. Within just a few days, Carl voluntarily began to talk. First, he calmly confessed to 3 murders that had occurred in the same summer. Carl then told investigators about the murders on his yacht, a murder in Angola. He also spoke of robbing President William Taft's home, even revealed plans to poison the water supply of an entire city with arsenic without blinking. "I have killed 21 people. I have sexually violated over 1,000 men. I have robbed, burned, and destroyed, and I feel no remorse." The authorities were stunned. No one had ever encountered a man who confessed to this level of cruelty so freely, with no plea deal, no coercion, and no signs of regret. Despite the shocking scope of his confession, Carl was only charged with burglary, weapons possession, and breaking and entering, due to lack of physical evidence in most of the murders. He received a 5-year sentence and was transferred to Clinton Correctional Facility in New York. Even in court, Carl refused legal representation, not because he lacked access, but because he wanted no defense. And unlike most defendants who hide behind denial or excuses, he leaned in grinning, owning every crime. After his sentencing, Carl was sent to Clinton. There, he lashed out at guards, violated rules, and self-harmed as a form of control. He was unmanageable, dangerous, and that's why the system had to move him to Washington, D.C. jail, not just to investigate his murders further, but because no one could contain him. What happened there was almost medieval. He was chained standing up for hours, his arms twisted behind him, feet dangling, and left in darkness. He didn't scream, he didn't beg. He simply stared at the guards in silence. In 1929, Carl was transferred to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, this time as a civilian prisoner. There, he said aloud, "I'll kill the first man that bothers me." And he kept his word. Just months later, he bludgeoned Robert Warmth, the prison laundry supervisor, to death with a 4-foot iron bar after being mocked in front of other inmates. Carl didn't run. He didn't resist. He stood silently and waited. "I told you I'd kill the first man that bothered me. I just did." He then was swiftly brought to trial, but instead of defending himself, Carl refused legal counsel, waived all appeals, and explicitly rejected any possibility of clemency. He even wrote directly to President Herbert Hoover, stating, "I am guilty. I want to die. Let me die." He accepted his sentence of death by hanging with the same cold detachment that he had applied to every other stage of his life. To Carl, the gallows were not justice. They were a form of liberation. In the months that followed, as he awaited execution, Carl became increasingly isolated. He refused all visitors and correspondence, declining to speak with chaplains or receive comfort of any kind. His only interaction was with Henry Lesser, a young prison guard who had shown him basic human decency. Through Lesser's quiet defiance of prison policy, Carl was given pen and paper with them. He began to write. Over several months, Carl produced a 20,000-word handwritten autobiography. He detailed his crimes from childhood through adulthood with chilling clarity. He wrote not to seek forgiveness, but to document the extent of his rage, his ideology, and his utter contempt for human life. One of the most haunting lines from his writing was, "If I had the power, I'd kill the whole damn human race." At one point, Lesser submitted a petition for clemency on Carl's behalf, hoping his brutal upbringing and psychological trauma might be grounds for leniency. When Carl found out, he was furious. He rejected Lesser's petition entirely and demanded it be withdrawn. On the morning of September 5, 1930, Carl Panzram walked to the no hesitation. He refused the services of a priest, declined to make peace with anyone, and looked death directly in the eye. When asked if he had any last words, he famously told the executioner, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 10 men while you're fooling around." At 6:18 a.m., he was pronounced dead. No family came to claim his body. He was buried in the prison cemetery, beneath a headstone marked only with the number 301614. His coldness in those final moments unsettled everyone present. Members of the execution team and medical staff later admitted to being deeply disturbed, not by the act of execution itself, but by how calmly and confidently Carl had embraced it. One guard described him as walking toward the gallows like a soldier receiving a medal, not a man meeting his end. For decades, Carl's autobiography was left unpublished. Lesser, who kept the manuscript, was unable to find a publisher willing to touch it. Its content was simply too dark. It wasn't until the 1970s that the work was finally released under the title, Killer, a Journal of Murder. Carl Panzram's story is not just a chronicle of violence. It is a brutal mirror held up to society's failures. He was shaped, scarred, and hardened by a world that punished but never protected, judged but never understood. His prisons didn't contain him, they fueled his hatred. Carl Panzram reminds us that monsters are not always born. Sometimes, they are made. And if we refuse to see that, we risk creating more of them. His life and his death stand as a warning. When we build systems that destroy empathy, we shouldn't be surprised when they produce people who have none. I remember it so clearly now. The smell, the heat, the way the juices ran down my fingers when I bit into that sandwich. It was good. I even told the guy it was the best barbecue I'd ever had. He just smiled. But weeks later, when the news broke about the murders, the roadside stand, the meat, my stomach dropped. I couldn't breathe. My hands started shaking. I went cold. I had eaten it. I know that I had eaten a human being. And the worst part, I liked it. I smiled. I complimented the monster who made it. This is the horrifying reaction from the customers of Joe Metheny, a burger stand owner. But the people of Baltimore would come to know him by another name. The barbecue burger butcher, in his own words, Joe said, "The human body tastes very similar to pork. If you mix it with ground meat, no one can tell the difference." And maybe they didn't. Too many questions here that what really happened to the victims before the burgers. How did a man butcher people, cut up their flesh, store it in his freezer, and feed it to strangers without anyone noticing? And most disturbingly, why did he do it? Was Joe Metheny just a deeply disturbed man, broken by addiction and trauma? Or was it something far darker? This is the story of Joe Metheny. And once you know what he did, you'll never look at a hamburger the same way again. The past that built a monster. Joseph Roy Metheny was born on March 2, 1955, in Baltimore, Maryland, one of 6 children in a poor, working-class family. His father was a laborer with a drinking problem, often absent even when he was home. In 1957, when Joe was just 2 years old, the family moved briefly to Terra Alta, West Virginia, searching for a new start. But that start never came. In 1961, when Joe was only 6, his father died in a car crash, and that fragile structure collapsed entirely. What was left was a grieving mother, Jan Metheny, now raising 6 children alone. She took whatever job she could find, working as a waitress and later as a food truck driver. Jean took pride in the fact that she never relied on welfare. But that pride came with a price. She was rarely ever home. Joe, like many kids in similar circumstances during that era, became what people called a latchkey kid, coming home to an empty house, alone, day after day. There was no father to guide him, and his mother was always working. The meals, the comfort, the warmth, he learned to find those on his own. Joe would later claim he'd been abandoned entirely, shuffled through foster homes, living with strangers, forgotten. But his mother disputed this. She said he was never in state care, only left with paid babysitters, because she had no other option. Still, Joe would go so far as to tell people his mother was dead. His mother said with others, "Maybe he just wishes I was." That line sticks. As a boy, he was quiet, intelligent, even promising. He had a strong interest in science, especially physics, and was described by teachers as capable and curious. But the promise didn't last. By 8th grade, he dropped out of school. Years later, he would earn his GED, but by then, his sense of direction was already deteriorating. At age 18, Joe enlisted in the U.S. Army. He told people he had served in Vietnam, that he'd seen combat, death, horror. But military records showed that he had never left Germany. It was just another layer of fiction, another mask for the man who wanted to seem tougher, deeper, more wounded than he really was. Psychologists would later point to Joe's traits, his chronic lying, his complete lack of empathy, as signs of narcissistic personality disorder. People with this disorder often project confidence but hide deep insecurity. They crave admiration, fabricate stories, and lack emotional connection with others. In Joe's case, that false narrative wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about constructing a world where he felt in control. After returning from the military, Joe brought something else home with him: addiction. That addiction would grow quickly, from addictive substances to alcohol, particularly Southern Comfort, a whiskey he drank almost nightly. Joe slipped into homelessness, living in tents and makeshift camps under bridges, surrounded by others just as lost. He began picking up arrests for assault, disorderly conduct, public intoxication. And yet somehow, he still managed to build something resembling a life. By the early 1990s, Joe had found work at a pallet factory, Stein & Sons, driving forklifts. He had a trailer to sleep in, a partner, and a young son. From the outside, it might have seemed like Joe was stabilizing. But underneath, the hunger, the chaos, never left him. Then came the collapse. In July of 1994, Joe came home from work and opened the door to find everything gone. His partner had taken all of their belongings, and their 6-year-old son, and vanished without a word. "My old lady had taken everything, including my son, and left me." He didn't care that she left, but she had taken the boy, and that broke something in him. For 6 months, Joe searched. Then came another devastating truth. She was living under a bridge, prostituting herself for addictive substances. And their son. He had been taken by Child Protective Services because of abuse and neglect. Joe wasn't just heartbroken, he was humiliated. Not only had he lost his son, he had lost the only part of himself he still loved. And worse, he felt powerless to do anything about it. In his mind, he had 2 options. Try to regain custody through the courts, impossible, he thought, with his criminal record. Or take revenge. The next best thing was to get revenge. He began asking around, looking for his ex, her new partner, asking where they stayed, who they were with. He found out they were living in Tent City, a homeless encampment beneath the Hanover Street Bridge. So one hot summer night in 1995, Joe Metheny grabbed an axe and headed straight into the dark. Before we enter the true nightmare, let's be clear, yes, Joe Metheny's past was filled with abandonment, addiction, and pain. Yes, he was hurt. Yes, he suffered. But pain is not permission. And a wounded past never justifies bloodshed. Not the lies, not the rage, and not what he did next. The murders and the burger stand. After losing his son in 1994 and spending months wandering through Baltimore's shadows, Joe Metheny decided he wasn't going to beg the courts. He was going to take revenge. He'd heard that his ex-partner was living beneath the Hanover Street Bridge, a stretch of crumbling concrete, arching over a forgotten part of the city. Locals called it Tent City, a makeshift homeless encampment where addiction, prostitution, and desperation clung to every corner. His ex and her new boyfriend were said to be living there. It was August 1995, thick, humid, and silent. That night, Joe brought an axe, and in his own words, arrived on a search and destroy mission. A mission that, by dawn, would leave a trail of bodies and a city forever haunted. But when he arrived, his intended targets were nowhere to be found. Instead, two homeless men, Randy and Randall Brewer, were sleeping on a filthy mattress just beneath the bridge. Metheny didn't ask who they were. He simply convinced himself they were part of the reason his son had been taken from him. And he did his job. They were there when I got there, and they were still there when I left. Except they were dead. But it didn't stop there. Still seething, still armed, Joe spotted two women nearby, sitting under the bridge. He approached one, told her he was looking for someone, and lured her just a few steps away. When she said she didn't know anything, he snapped. He beat her. He raped her. And then he killed her, dragging her body into the underbrush, trying to hide the evidence beneath a mess of weeds and branches. Then he went back for the second woman. She begged for her life, swearing she didn't know anything. It didn't matter. The same pattern. The same end. Beaten, raped, killed. As Joe dragged her body into the bushes, he spotted a fifth person, an elderly man, fishing quietly by the river. Joe didn't hesitate. He grabbed a steel pipe from the trash nearby and rushed him, beating him to death on the riverbank. Then, like someone completing a job, he dragged the three bodies, the two women and the fisherman, into deeper brush, piled rocks over them, rinsed the blood from his hands in the Patapsco River, and calmly disappeared into the night. But that wasn't the only blood spilled under the bridge. That same night, a sixth person, Everett Dowell, was killed, not by Joe, but by another homeless man named Larry Amos, who had found the axe Joe left behind. Amos used it to settle his own score with Dowell, adding more chaos to an already horrific scene. Multiple victims, shared weapons, confused timelines. After the brutal massacre under the Hanover Street Bridge, Joe Metheny was not immediately caught. After the first arrest for this crime, he returned to his everyday life, continuing to work at the Stein & Sons pallet factory and living in a trailer parked right on the company grounds. In November 1996, Joe met Kimberly Lynn Spicer at a local bar. He lured her back to his trailer with promises of drugs, but when Kimberly refused his sexual advances, Joe snapped. He stabbed her 26 times, in the chest, face, back, and abdomen. After the savage attack, Joe dismembered her body. He cut away the meatiest parts, which he then stored in Tupperware containers inside his freezer, while the rest of her remains were buried around the factory property. Joe did not simply consume the human flesh immediately. He planned a twisted business venture. He set up a roadside barbecue stand just outside the pallet factory, along a road frequented by truck drivers and factory workers. This stand was no ordinary food stall. It sold barbecue sandwiches mixed with human flesh. Joe admitted to mixing the human meat with pork and beef, claiming that nobody could tell the difference. For weeks, Joe's stand was a huge success. The sandwiches sold out daily, with customers praising the flavor as the best they had ever tasted. No one questioned or suspected the true source of the meat. The stand operated continuously for several weeks, drawing a steady stream of customers. Eventually, Joe ran out of his special ingredient and began planning to find more victims to keep his gruesome supply going. In a chilling revelation, confessed that he tasted the human meat himself before selling it, confirming that it closely resembled pork. This act was not only brutal, but also demonstrated a disturbing sense of control, transforming his victims into food, and then forcing others to unknowingly consume them. From a psychological standpoint, forensic psychologist Dr. Eric Hickey explains that only a tiny fraction of serial killers, about 0.5%, are true cannibals. Cannibalism among killers is rarely about survival. Instead, it is about total domination and possession of their victims. The investigation, problems, and arrests. After the brutal massacre under the Hanover Street Bridge, the bodies of the victims were discovered only after significant delays. Sometimes weeks passed before police found the remains. Many of these bodies were in advanced states of decomposition, making it nearly impossible to identify the victims or determine the exact cause of death. Moreover, Joe Metheny himself claimed responsibility for murders, but many of these claims could not be substantiated by physical evidence, leaving the true number of victims uncertain. The chaotic backdrop in Tent City and surrounding areas also complicated evidence gathering and witness cooperation. To make matters worse, Joe was a master manipulator and skilled liar, often weaving elaborate stories that blurred fact and fiction, challenging investigators to separate truth from fabrication. Additionally, confusion arose for the shared acts, making it difficult to ascertain exactly who was responsible for each death. The first time they caught Joe was after the discovery of 2 murdered homeless men. However, due to insufficient concrete evidence tying him directly to the crimes, he was released after spending approximately 18 months in jail awaiting trial. The investigation took a dramatic turn in December 1996 when Rita Kemper, Joe's latest victim, miraculously escaped from his trailer. After a violent assault, she managed to flee by climbing over a high, barbed wire fence and sought help from a passing truck driver. Her detailed description of the attack and Joe's whereabouts gave police the critical information needed to zero in on him. Police swiftly moved to arrest Joe Metheny for the second time on December 8, 1996, apprehending him at his trailer under tense and dramatic circumstances. Joe was attempting to leave when officers arrived. He was ordered to lie face down on the ground and was taken into custody without resistance. The breakthrough was aided by a tip-off from one of Joe's drug-addicted friends who revealed that Joe had asked for help to dig up the body of Kimberly Spicer and move it. His name was Clint Ashbrook. Interestingly, during the course of this investigation, it was revealed that Joe Metheny worked for Stein & Sons, a company under FBI scrutiny for involvement in arms trafficking, fraud, and arson. The company's owner, Joe Stein Sr., was a convicted criminal, while his son, Joe Stein Jr., was an FBI informant working to bring down his father. Joe Metheny was suspected of serving as the company's enforcer, a role involving intimidation and violent enforcement on behalf of the organization. Clint first had told the crime of Joe to Joe Stein Sr., but he actively prevented Clint from reporting the crime to the police, not out of loyalty to Metheny, but to avoid FBI raids that could expose the company's illicit activities. This dynamic complicated the investigation, as the FBI had to navigate both organized crime and the gruesome serial killings tied to Metheny. The undone findings. After being arrested, Joe initially denied all charges against him. However, as the evidence mounted and became undeniable, he began to open up, slowly confessing to a series of brutal murders. He admitted to having killed at least 13 people, providing chilling details about how he murdered his victims, dismembered their bodies, and in some cases, even ate them. Among the victims, they confirmed another victim named Kathy Ann Magaziner, a 39-year-old woman he murdered in 1994. Metheny strangled Kathy to death before burying her body in a shallow grave right on the grounds of the pallet factory where he worked. Her remains lay undisturbed in that grave for more than 2 years. According to Joe's later confession, 6 months after the burial, he dug up her skeleton, removed her head, placed it in a box, and discarded it in the trash. Kathy Ann Magaziner was identified through dental records and other forensic methods after Joe led police to the location of her body. Kimberly Spicer's remains were discovered thanks to a tip from one of Joe's acquaintances, leading to a search and excavation at the factory grounds. Beyond these two, many of the victims Joe confessed to killing remain unidentified, and their bodies were either lost to the river's currents or hidden in remote wooded areas. Many were homeless or lived on the fringes of society, making the full extent of Joe's crimes difficult to determine. Investigators and forensic experts expressed skepticism regarding some parts of Joe's confessions. They suspected that he exaggerated or fabricated certain details, possibly to gain notoriety or manipulate the investigation. Joe was known for his elaborate lies and unstable psychological state, which made it challenging to separate truth from deception. Joe Metheny faced multiple official charges, including murder, assault, and kidnapping, related to confirmed victims such as Kathy Ann Magaziner, Kimberly Spicer, and Rita Kemper. However, despite his own shocking admissions, allegations concerning cannibalism or the mixing of human flesh into food products were never formally charged due to a lack of concrete evidence. The authorities could not prove that any customers were aware they were consuming human meat, making prosecution on these grounds impossible. In 1998, Joe Metheny pleaded guilty to the murder of Kathy Ann Magaziner. On July 14, 2000, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Additionally, he received a 50-year sentence for the kidnapping and assault of Rita Kemper, the only victim who survived an attack by Metheny. These convictions marked the official legal closure on the crimes that could be substantiated. Joe spent the remainder of his life incarcerated in a Maryland prison. On August 5, 2017, he died while in custody, though the exact cause of death was never publicly disclosed. There has been speculation about whether his death was natural, a suicide, or even foul play, but no definitive evidence has been released. Putting aside the uncertainty about the burgers and how many people ate them, the major uncertainty concerns were the actual number of victims. While Joe claimed responsibility for murdering 13 individuals, only 2 to 3 bodies were ever recovered and conclusively identified by law enforcement. Mental health professionals have debated Joe's psychological condition extensively. While many agree he exhibited traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, others suggest he might have suffered from more severe mental illnesses, such as schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders. The true nature of his mental state, however, was never definitively diagnosed. The story of Joe Metheny is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can grow when pain, neglect, and addiction go unchecked. It shows us how a broken past can twist a person's mind and lead them down a path of unimaginable horror. But this tale also forces us to ask difficult questions. Should we find compassion for someone like Joe? Does understanding his past mean excusing his actions? Or does it challenge us to look deeper, to find ways to prevent such tragedies before they start? In the end, the story of Joe Metheny is not just about a killer. It is a call to reflect on the fragile humanity within us all, and the choices that define us. August 8, 1973, Houston, Texas. At exactly 8:24 a.m., a phone call jolts the emergency dispatch center. A teenage voice trembles on the other, "Y'all better come here right now. I just killed a man." When officers arrive at 2020 Lamar Drive, they step into a modest suburban home, quiet, unassuming, until they see the body, naked, bleeding, shot 6 times. The body lying slumped against the hallway wall was Dean Arnold Corll, a man known in the neighborhood as the CandyMan, the soft-spoken former candy factory vice president who used to hand out sweets to children. However, Dean Corll wasn't just a victim in this case. He was a torturer, a sadist, and a master manipulator who lured dozens of teenage boys into his home, tied them to a plywood board, and subjected them to unimaginable torment, sometimes for days, before killing and disposing of their bodies. With the help of 2 teenage accomplices, Corll operated in plain sight for 3 years, burying his victims beneath boat sheds, beaches, and forest floors. Some of them were friends of the boys who helped him. Some were never even reported missing. So frightening? So how did a man once beloved by parents and children alike become the worst man of Houston Heights? Why did no one stop him, and what led to his death? This is the story of Dean Corll, the CandyMan, the forgotten monster. Who was Dean Corll? Dean Arnold Corll was born on December 24, 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Christmas Eve. His father, Arnold Corll, was a strict and emotionally distant man. His mother, Mary Robinson, was the opposite, overprotective, controlling, and blindly devoted to her son, with religious zeal. Dean's childhood was marked by instability and illness. At age 7, he suffered from rheumatic fever, which left him with a permanent heart murmur diagnosed at 11. Because of this, he was excused from physical activity in school, something that separated him even further from his peers. He was shy, quiet, and deeply introverted. One childhood incident reportedly left a lasting impact. That was at a birthday party. Dean was the only child who didn't receive a prize. According to Mary, he shut down emotionally after that. He withdrew from others and never came back. Later, the family moved to Vidor, Texas. It was here that Dean's behavior escalated. He began torturing and killing flying squirrels, stringing their corpses around his neck, or stuffing them into his cowboy boots. Around age 10, Dean spent a summer on his grandmother's farm in Indiana. His sexual education, as his mother would later call it, came from watching farm animals mate. Mary once said, "That's all the sexual education a boy needs." What Dean learned, however, was far from healthy. During this same period, he began filming videos with 2 neighbor girls, directing them to perform mock surgeries using disemboweled chickens as stand-ins for organs. The adults in the area simply brushed it off, they said. Dean's just a strange but sweet kid. In his early 20s, Dean entered his only serious heterosexual relationship. In 1962, the woman proposed marriage. Dean rejected her. Shortly afterward, he left Indiana and never looked back. In 1964, Dean was drafted into the U.S. Army and assigned to Fort Hood, Texas as a radio repairman. It was there that he reportedly had his first homosexual encounters, an experience that only complicated his identity in a time of intense cultural shame and repression. Less than a year into his service, Dean was honorably discharged, not for misconduct, but because his mother called the Army, insisting he was needed at home to help run the family candy company. They agreed. Back in Houston, Mary reopened Coral Candy Company, this time placing it directly across from an elementary school. Dean, in his mid-20s, was made vice president. His daily routine included running the machines and distributing broken candy pieces to neighborhood children. He was loved for it. To the community, Dean was harmless, sweet, even generous. They called him the CandyMan. Others dubbed him the Pied Piper. Behind the scenes, Dean showed no interest in women, and he began spending increasing amounts of time with teenage boys. He converted the back room of the candy factory into a hangout space, complete with a pool table. The boys drank, smoked, and felt welcome. He let them do whatever they wanted, no rules, no judgment. Some adult workers noticed his discomfort around women and his enthusiasm for teen boys. One teenage employee accused Dean of making unwanted sexual advances. Mary's response: she fired the boy. She never questioned her son. To her, Dean was flawless. She once claimed, "Dean could walk on water, just like Jesus." After Mary moved to Colorado, Dean was left alone in Houston. That's when he took things further. He converted a small shed into his private teenage paradise. There was a TV, stereo, blacklight, and even an alarm system that blinked red whenever someone approached. Dean invited local boys to hang out. They came in groups, thinking it was cool fun, even safe. Their parents never questioned it. The toxic partnership of a predator. In 1967, Dean met David Brooks, a boy about 12 years old. From this initial encounter, Dean began grooming David through gifts, money, and inappropriate advances. David was one of Dean's first victims of manipulation and abuse, subjected to coercive control at a very young age. Despite the trauma, over time David became more than a victim. He transformed into Dean's assistant and accomplice, aiding in recruiting new victims. The first confirmed murder linked to Dean occurred in September 1970, with the disappearance of Jeffrey Conan, a university student hitchhiking in Houston. Dean's brutality was becoming evident, and later year, David accidentally witnessed Dean torturing two boys in his apartment. Instead of going to the authorities, David was persuaded to remain silent through promises and gifts. This marked the beginning of David's active involvement. By late 19's active involvement, David helped Dean lure victims, such as James Glass and Danny Yates, both 14 years old, to Dean's residence. Dean was also known to have kept two unidentified boys alive for several days before their deaths, showcasing an escalation in his cruelty. On January 30, 1971, Dean and David kidnapped brothers Donald, 15 years old, and Jerry Waldrop, 13 years old, brutally ending their lives and disposing of their bodies. Between March and May, their spree continued with the murders of Randall Harvey, 15 years old, David Hillig, 13 years old, and Gregory Winkle, 16 years old. Toward the end of 1971, David lured his close friend Reuben Watson Haney, who was 17 at that time, to Dean's apartment, where Haney was killed. Throughout this period, Dean's financial resources played a critical role. He paid David increasing sums of money, starting with small amounts for cooperation and rising to approximately $200 for each victim David brought in. Dean's gift of a green Cher Corvette to David was more than a present, it was a tool for control and loyalty. Besides income from the candy company, Dean's funds also came from the exploitation of his victims and the maintenance of his network. He used this money to rent spaces for his activities, purchase restraint and other equipment, buy candy as bait, and cover living expenses. At the beginning of 1972, Elmer Wayne Henley entered Dean Corll's world. Originally introduced to Dean through David Brooks, Henley initially intended as another victim. However, Dean saw potential in the 15-year-old and recruited him as a partner. From that point onward, Henley began actively participating in luring boys to Dean's lair. On February 9, 1972, Henley and Dean kidnapped 17-year-old Willard Branch Jr., marking Henley's first direct involvement in an abduction. The two continued their sinister spree throughout the spring. In March, Henley lured his friend Frank Aguirre, aged 18, to Dean's apartment, where Frank met his tragic end. April saw Henley convincing 17-year-old Mark Scott to come along. Although Mark fought back fiercely, he was ultimately killed. In May of the same year, Henley participated in the murders of Johnny Delhomme and Billy Balch. During the summer months, Henley and David Brooks cooperated in the killings of Stephen Sickman, 17, and Roy Bunton, 19. Toward the end of 1972, the pair abducted and murdered Wally J. Simone and Richard Hembry. On November 12, 19-year-old Richard Kepner disappeared, and in January 1973, Henley and David took the life of Joseph Lyles, David's 17-year-old neighbor. Throughout this period, Dean continued to pay Henley for every victim he brought in, maintaining a similar payment structure to that which he had with David Brooks, around $200 per successful lure. Reports suggest that around this time, Dean's candy company began to decline or perhaps even close, resulting in financial pressures. To compensate, Dean expanded his methods of recruiting victims, employing a white van equipped for travel, and fitted with soundproofing to facilitate his activities without detection. He hosted parties featuring alcohol, tobacco, and drugs to attract more boys, broadening the net of his horrifying enterprise. The money paid to David Brooks and Henley effectively financed Dean's ongoing supply chain of victims, transforming his crimes into an organized and continuous system of exploitation and murder. The end of the CandyMan. Before his brutal death in August 1973, Dean Corll's grip on Houston's darkest secrets was beginning to slip. He was reportedly planning to leave the city and move back to live with his mother in Colorado. This decision hinted at mounting pressure from his accomplices and a growing risk of exposure. His once ironclad control over his network was weakening. The summer of 1973 marked the final deadly spree of Corll and his two accomplices. In June, they abducted and tortured 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence for 3 days before strangling him to death. The violence escalated quickly. By July, Ray Blackburn, a 20-year-old family man, went missing. Soon after, Henley lured 15-year-old Hummer Garcia to Dean's house, where the boy was shot and bled to death in the bathtub. Over just 3 weeks that summer, the trio murdered 5 more boys in rapid succession. The intensity and frequency of the killings reflected a desperate attempt by Corll and his cohorts to maintain control as their world unraveled. On August 8, 1973, the final horrifying event unfolded when Elmer Wayne Henley brought along his girlfriend, Rhonda Williams, who was also the daughter of a close friend of Dean Corll, and her boyfriend, Timothy Curley, to Corll's house. Their presence enraged Corll. He reportedly planned to kill all 3 in a fit of rage over the unexpected arrival of his daughter and her boyfriend. However, Henley, having gradually realized Corll's brutality and true nature, decided to act to end the nightmare. His motivation was not only fear but also a rebellion against Corll's control and violence. Fueled by a desperate desire to save himself and those he cared about from death, Henley drew a gun and fired 6 shots at Corll, ending the life of one of America's most notorious serial killers. This act not only freed Henley and his companions, but also marked the end of one of the most horrifying crime sprees in American history. After shooting Corll, Henley called the police to the scene, gave a detailed confession about the murders, and led them to the locations where the victims' bodies were buried. Henley's actions uncovered the truth behind years of mysterious disappearances, shocking both the local community and the nation. Bodies, betrayals, and broken boys. After Elmer Wayne Henley shot Dean Corll and called the police, he cooperated fully with investigators, providing detailed information about where Corll had hidden the bodies of his victims. Over the following weeks, police excavated multiple locations and uncovered a total of 27 bodies. These remains were scattered across several key sites: 17 in Aboche, 6 on High Island Beach, 4 at Lake Sam Rayburn, and 1 in Jefferson County. The condition of the bodies was horrifying. Many were wrapped tightly in thick plastic bags. In some cases, victims' mouths were still open wide when found, suggesting the terrifying possibility that they were buried alive or suffocated while wrapped in the bags. Investigators also discovered a small wooden box with ventilation holes containing human hair, which implied that some victims might have been confined alive in the box before their deaths. The recovery process was grueling and fraught with challenges. Sweltering summer heat, sticky blood-soaked mud, and the sheer volume of remains made the excavation difficult. Authorities controversially employed prison inmates to assist with the digging, a decision that sparked ethical debates. At one point, the police halted further excavation, reportedly because they had uncovered enough victims to set a new record for serial killings in the United States, and feared the negative publicity that would follow. This decision left lingering suspicions that more victims remained undiscovered. David Brooks was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1975 for his role as an accomplice in Dean Corll's series of murders. Although given a severe sentence, Brooks consistently maintained that he did not directly commit the murders but was instead manipulated and coerced into participating. He spent decades behind bars and passed away in prison in 2020 due to complications related to COVID-19. Elmer Wayne Henley received a total of 6 consecutive life terms, each lasting 99 years, amounting to 594 years in prison. His initial trial took place in 1974, resulting in a harsh sentence. Henley was retried in 1979, but his sentence remained unchanged. Throughout the proceedings, Henley claimed that he was psychologically controlled by Dean Corll, but acted heroically when he shot and killed Corll to save others. Henley remains incarcerated and is eligible for parole or sentence reduction in the future. The sentences imposed on these two accomplices reflect the complexity of the case, as both David Brooks and Henley were victims as well as perpetrators within this horrific crime spree. Two survivors, Rhonda Williams and Timothy Curley, endured the psychological aftermath of the ordeal. Timothy struggled with mental illness and addiction, ultimately dying from a heart attack in 2008. Rhonda lived with lasting trauma and fear. In 2005, she courageously confronted Henley in prison, where he confessed that he had once almost killed her instead of Corll. Despite the case's severity, it received relatively little media attention. The families of the victims suffered tremendous loss with little public support or recognition. Though Dean Corll is recognized as one of America's most notorious serial killers, his name remains less familiar compared to others, overshadowed by the neglect and silence surrounding his victims and their communities. The story of Dean Corll is a chilling reminder of how evil can hide behind a mask of kindness and how vulnerable lives can be shattered in silence. Dean Corll preyed on boys who were already marginalized, runaways, loners. This case exposes the dangers of unchecked abuse, the consequences of societal neglect, and the failure of systems meant to protect the most defenseless. His accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, were themselves victims, caught in a web of manipulation and terror. Yet, both were sentenced to life imprisonment, held accountable for their roles in unspeakable crimes. This raises a difficult question: did justice truly serve David and, especially Henley? Were they cold-hearted criminals, or were they young boys broken and controlled by a monster beyond their control? It was a cold, quiet night in Moscow, Idaho. On November 13, 2022, sometime between 4 and 40:25 m.m., something horrifying happened inside a story rental home at 1122 King Road. By noon, 4 University of Idaho students Kligonkovs, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were found brutally murdered in their beds. No signs of forced entry. No stolen items. No suspects. No answers. For fear gripped the community. Students fled campus. Police worked silently under a heavy gag order. And still no arrests. Until December 30th, they found 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger, a PhD student in criminology at Washington State University, just 10 miles from the crime scene. As investigators dug deeper, they began to uncover a disturbing pattern. Kohberger had studied under renowned forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland. Some even believe Kohberger may have chosen WSU specifically to learn from her, and possibly to emulate her most infamous subject, the BTK killer, Dennis Rader. Enough men showed signs of obsession, control, and calculated violence. Both struck at age 28. Both began with 4 victims. Could this be a coincidence? Or is there a far more disturbing truth lurking underneath? Did he try to become the next BTK? This is the story of Bryan Kohberger. How the Idaho murders occurred. It happened inside a quiet, off-campus house on 1122 King Road, Moscow, Idaho, a 3-story rental home filled with laughter, music, and the routines of 6 University of Idaho students. There were 6 people inside the house that Saturday night, November 12, 2022. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogan, both 21, were best friends since middle school. They lived on the 3rd floor and spent the night out at the Corner Club, a downtown bar. On the 2nd floor were Xana Kernodle and her boyfriend Ethan Chapin, both 20. Who had attended a party just across the street at the Sigma Chi fraternity. Dullan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, the 2 surviving roommates, stayed in their rooms on the ground floor. At 1:40 a.m., Kaylee and Maddie were spotted on video at Grub Truck, ordering late night food. They appeared carefree, laughing, chatting, waiting for their ride. Around 1:45 a.m., Xana and Ethan returned home from the fraternity. Shortly after, Kaylee and Maddie were driven back to the house as well. At 4:00 a.m., a DoorDash order was delivered to the house. At that same time, Xana's TikTok account showed activity, suggesting she was still awake. Between 4:00 and 4:25 a.m., the killer entered the home. 4 people were murdered, swiftly, silently, and with precision. On the 1st floor, Dullan Mortensen later said she heard soft crying, followed by a male voice saying, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." She opened her bedroom door 3 times that night. The final time, She saw a man dressed in black, wearing a mask, with bushy eyebrows, walking past her and exiting through the sliding glass door. She locked her door and stayed inside. At 4:17 a.m., a neighbor's security camera picked up 3 chilling sounds: a faint whimper, a loud thud, and a dog barking in the stillness of night. These were the only audible clues that something horrific had just happened next door. Later that morning, around 9:00 a.m., one of the surviving roommates noticed something was wrong. Then, at 11:58 a.m., a 911 call was placed. The message was vague: "There's someone unconscious." No one knew yet that 4 lives had already been taken. On the 3rd floor, Kaylee and Maddie were found in bed, lying side by side. There were no signs of a struggle. It's believed they were attacked while asleep. On the 2nd floor, the scene was different. Zana's room showed signs of a fight. Her injuries indicated that she fought back. Ethan, likely caught off guard and unarmed, suffered severe wounds, including a slashed artery and deep cuts to his legs, injuries so brutal they left even experienced professionals stunned. And perhaps the most chilling twist that night, Ashlyn, Maddie's close friend, had originally planned to sleep over at the house. At the very last minute, she changed her mind. She never came. The investigation unfolds. When 4 students were found murdered inside a quiet rental house in Moscow, Idaho, it didn't just shake the town, it stopped the entire country. The brutality of the crime, combined with the lack of immediate answers, sent waves of fear and confusion across the community. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious suspects, and no eyewitnesses. It seemed like the killer had vanished into thin air. In the days that followed, authorities imposed a strict gag order. Police, lawyers, and even the victims' families were barred from speaking publicly. The silence was deafening. Without answers, the public turned to speculation. Conspiracy theories, internet detectives, and anonymous rumors flooded social media. But behind the scenes, they were chasing a trail that began with a car. Surveillance footage revealed a white Hyundai Elantra circling the neighborhood in the early morning hours of November 13th. The car passed by the King Road house at least 7 times, and was last seen speeding away around 4:20 a.m., just minutes after a neighbor's security camera recorded a dog barking, a loud thud, and a faint whimper at 4:17. Police issued a bulletin asking the public to help locate a white Hyundai Elantra, model year 2011 to 2013. That lead would point them to Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old PhD student in criminology at Washington State University, located just 10 miles from the crime scene. Investigators pulled his phone records, and what they found was chilling. Kohberger's phone had pinged near the victim's house approximately 23 times in the weeks before the murders, often in the late night or early morning hours. On the night of the killings, his phone was turned off from 2:47 a.m. to 5:30 a.m. Then at 9:00 a.m., just hours after the murders, the device reappeared near the King Road area. Even more suspicious, he made 3 long phone calls that morning to numbers tied to his father's phone plan. Back at the crime scene, investigators uncovered their first major piece of physical evidence: a bar knife sheath found beside the body of Madison Mogan. On the snap button of the sheath was a tiny trace of DNA. It didn't match any of the victims, and it didn't belong to anyone in the system. But it was enough to pursue genetic genealogy, a process of using family DNA trees to track down relatives of the unknown source. Around this time, Kohberger had returned home to Albrightsville, Pennsylvania for the holidays. Agents discreetly collected trash from outside his parents' home and extracted DNA from his father. The results confirmed what they feared: the DNA on the knife sheath was a close match to Kohberger's family. That was all they needed. On December 2022 at 1:30 a.m., a SWAT team raided the Kohberger residence. Inside, they found Bryan in the dark kitchen, wearing rubber gloves and sorting garbage into plastic Ziploc bags. It appeared he was trying to eliminate potential evidence. He was taken into custody without incident. The arrest led to a deeper search of his devices. It was so disturbing that Kohberger had saved screenshots of Instagram profiles belonging to multiple young women, many of them blonde, and several with direct connections to Kaylee, Maddie, and Jana. He had also saved images of the King Road house and had allegedly liked several posts from Maddie and Kaylee before the murders. His internet history revealed searches like University of Idaho murders, Ted Bundy crime scene, drugged victims, and sleeping girls attacked. Just 2 days before his arrest, he took a selfie wearing all black, eerily resembling the figure described by surviving roommate Dylan Mortensen, a man in black clothing, wearing a mask, with bushy eyebrows, who walked past her in silence. But perhaps the most revealing clue came not from his photos or phone records, but from his academic history. Kohberger had spent years studying the criminal mind. He had even distributed surveys to former criminals, asking them why they chose their victims and how they felt after committing their crimes. Months earlier, he had also applied for an internship with the Pullman Police Department, stating he wanted to help law enforcement improve data analysis and understanding of criminal behavior. All of it pointed to one chilling conclusion. Bryan Kohberger hadn't just studied crime, he had studied how to get away with it. So who is Bryan Kohberger? The making of a killer. Bryan Christopher Kohberger was born in 1994 and raised in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, in what appeared to be a stable, working-class family. Those who knew him as a child described him as awkward, quiet, and highly intelligent, but also someone who often seemed out of place. He was bullied throughout his school years for his weight, mannerisms, and social discomfort. But in his late teens, everything changed. Kohberger began battling substance abuse. After what was described as a difficult and isolated recovery, Bryan went through a drastic physical and psychological transformation. He lost nearly 100 pounds in a short span of time. His struggle to reclaim control over his body quickly spiraled into obsession with food, routine, and purity. Friends recalled that he became extremely rigid, adopting a strict vegan diet and refusing to eat anything cooked in pans that had previously touched meat. His routines were meticulous. He was described as obsessed with cleanliness and displayed what some believed to be a cleanliness compulsion bordering on delusional. During his stay at his parents' house before his arrest, Kohberger was reportedly seen wearing latex gloves indoors, even while handling trash, a sign of mild paranoid delusion and an attempt to avoid leaving DNA on any surface. For those around him, this seemed like more than caution. It seemed like a man trying to erase himself, physically, forensically, and psychologically. Kohberger earned a bachelor's degree in criminal justice at DeSales University, and later completed a master's in criminology. During this time, he began to explore not just crime, but the minds of criminals. In 2022, he moved to Washington State to begin a PhD in criminology at WSU. Located just 10 miles from the eventual crime scene, he lived alone in an off-campus apartment and worked as a teaching assistant. His students described him as sharp but condescending, someone who often challenged others in class, derailing discussions toward topics like morality, control, and murder. As mentioned, he applied for an internship with the Pullman Police Department, saying he wanted to assist law enforcement with understanding criminal behavior through technology and analysis. But outside the classroom, Bryan's behavior became increasingly troubling. One female colleague recalled how her apartment key disappeared, only to mysteriously return later. Soon after, her belongings were subtly rearranged, and a baked item appeared in her microwave, something she had never purchased or prepared. She described it not as a prank, but as a test of psychological boundary crossing. Others said Bryan had a way of staring at people, unblinking, focused, as if studying them. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply made people feel watched, even when they were alone. Despite these red flags, there were no formal complaints. No criminal history. Theories behind Bryan Kohberger's motive. One of the leading psychological theories suggests that Bryan Kohberger was driven by an obsessive need for control. From his strict vegan diet to refusing to eat food cooked in pans used by others, and even reportedly wearing latex gloves inside his parents' home, his behaviors reflected deep, rooted compulsions. The murders may have been, in his mind, a final assertion of power over victims who never saw it coming. Another theory centers on academic obsession pushed to a dangerous extreme. While studying criminology, Kohberger conducted surveys with former offenders, asking unsettling questions about their crimes. He also applied for an internship at the Pullman Police Department, possibly seeking closer insight into how investigations work or how to avoid them. A third theory is that he wanted to outsmart the system. The education background equipped him with advanced knowledge and maybe wanted to examine what he's known by executing a perfect crime. There's also the theory of psychological transformation from bullied outcast to controlling predator. Experts believe the dramatic shift in an addiction and losing over 100 pounds may have fueled a desire to reverse the power dynamic, to move from victimhood to dominance, possibly through violence. Beside that, some believe there may have been no clear motive at all. Kohberger left behind no confession, no demands, no personal grievance. The absence of emotional or practical triggers leads to a chilling possibility. He may have killed simply to feel something, to fill a psychological void. This pattern is often seen in functional psychopaths, whose crimes are born not out of rage or revenge, but emotional emptiness. One of the most disturbing theories about Bryan Kohberger is that he may have been a copycat killer, not just fascinated by infamous murderers, but actively imitating them. He's believed to have drawn influence from Ted Bundy, Richard Ramirez, and most notably, Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. With Bundy, the connection lies in intellect and presentation. Kohberger searched for Ted Bundy and the perfect killing machine before his arrest. Both were highly educated, deeply familiar with law enforcement procedures, and projected a calm, controlled image that concealed cold, calculated brutality. Kohberger's methods also echo those of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Like Ramirez, he allegedly stalked his victims for weeks, then struck in the early hours of the morning, between 400 and 4:25 a.m. when they were most vulnerable. His silent, methodical attack closely mirrors Ramirez's nocturnal, predatory approach. But the strongest parallel is with Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. Kohberger studied criminology under Dr. Catherine Ramsland, BTK's official biographer. Through her, he may have accessed Rader's detailed confessions and behavioral patterns, gaining intimate insight to the mind of a methodical serial killer. The similarities are striking. Both of them were 28 at the time of their first known murders. They killed 4 victims at once inside a home. None of them had a criminal record. They killed silently, without personal motive or sexual assault. They stood silent in court, requiring judges to enter pleas for them. And they engaged in psychological games with law enforcement. Rader left taunting letters. Kohberger allegedly turned off his phone, returned to the crime scene, and sorted his trash into Ziploc bags, suggesting a deliberate effort to challenge investigators. These details have fueled theories that Kohberger may have modeled his crime after BTK, either as a form of tribute, competition, or experimental reenactment. Adding to the speculation, Carrie Rawson, BTK's daughter, stated she wouldn't be surprised if Kohberger had written to her father. No direct evidence confirms this, but the connection, academic, behavioral, and symbolic, is hard to ignore. When will the case close? On January 3, 2023, Kohberger waived extradition and was transported to Lainey, Idaho by plane. 2 days later, on January 5, he made his first court appearance. Rather than enter a plea, he stood silent, prompting the judge to enter a not guilty plea on his behalf. He was denied bail and remains in custody to this day. In May 2023, Kohberger's defense requested a delay in the preliminary hearing to allow more time to prepare, which the court granted. Then, on June 26, a grand jury formally indicted Kohberger, reaffirming the original 5 charges. Prosecutors cited key evidence such as cell phone tracking DNA on a knife sheath found at the scene, and Kohberger's repeated visits near the victim's home. Between August and October 2023, Kohberger's defense team filed motions challenging the death penalty, arguing that the trace DNA evidence was scientifically weak and that his arrest procedures violated constitutional protections. Despite this, in October 2023, Latos County prosecutors confirmed they would pursue the death penalty if Kohberger is found guilty, the maximum sentence allowed under Idaho law. In early 2024, the case continued to stall due to legal motions from the defense. They challenged the legality of the grand jury indictment, requested additional DNA analysis, and even moved to change the trial venue, claiming the local jury pool was too biased by media coverage. The trial, initially expected to begin in 2024, was postponed again, this time to late 2024 or early 2025. As of mid-2025, Bryan Kohberger remains in pre-trial detention at Lada County Jail, held without bail. A trial date has yet to be announced. He still faces the possibility of capital punishment, and his defense continues to fight the admissibility and credibility of key evidence. In April 2025, prosecutors released a detailed list of physical and digital evidence they intend to present at trial. Prosecutors argue that all submitted evidence is self-authenticating, meaning it does not require expert witnesses to be admitted at trial. The court will now decide whether to accept this claim or require expert testimony. The case against Bryan Kohberger continues to evolve. But more than 2 years after the murders, justice for the 4 victims still awaits its day in court. This case serves as a chilling reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, especially about evil, is not without risk. When the study of darkness is not anchored by morality, empathy, or professional boundaries, it can begin to blur into something far more dangerous. Bryan Kohberger wasn't just analyzing criminal behavior, he may have stepped into it. That reveals a deeper truth: evil, when admired without caution, can be contagious. This tragedy reminds us that intellectual curiosity must never come at the cost of conscience, and that when fascination becomes imitation, the consequences can be fatal. Hey there, friend. You being here, right now with me, that means we've got something to talk about, don't we? Go ahead, sit down and raw bite. At least, not anymore. Listen closely, let me tell you my story. Before the so-called good guys out there rewrite it, twist it into something clean, something easy for people to sleep at night. Tell me, do you believe in evil? In real, living, breathing evil? Doesn't matter how you answer. Just keep listening. I know you've heard the names. They once called me the devil's disciple, so I really hate the reporters. They say I took lives. Lots of people. Women. Old, young. I remember some. Others they blurred together. Some people say I'm the most disgusting of the disgusting. The most dangerous of the daints. Maybe they're right. But I wasn't born that way. I became it. And if you stay a while, I'll show you exactly how. The time for scaring is over. This is a what if, like, what if Richard actually had his own YouTube channel? But real talk, this guy was seriously dangerous. Richard Ramirez was a notorious serial killer back in the 1980s, known as the Night Stalker. He broke into people's homes and carried out some truly horrifying murders and assaults, leaving the whole state of California in absolute fear. Shadows of a Broken Boy. Richard Ramirez was born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas. The youngest child in a traditional, working-class Mexican-American Catholic family. To the outside world, his upbringing might have seemed structured, even admirable. His father, Julian Ramirez, was a former police officer who had earned the reputation of being an exemplary man of law and discipline, respected by his peers and community. Julian upheld religious values at home. He made his children go to church regularly, and strongly encouraged Richard to become an altar boy. A young servant of the church, standing near the cross, reciting prayers, doing what's right. But behind that image was a household ruled by fear. Julian was brutal, prone to explosive rages and violent outbursts. He beat his wife and children with fists, leather belts, even blunt tools like broomsticks and hammers. He was especially hard on Richard, the youngest, the most vulnerable. Richard endured physical trauma from a very young age, including a severe head injury that required stitches when a dresser fell on him at age 2. This was the first contradiction that twisted Richard's view of the world. True, how could a man be celebrated in public, but feared in private? How could someone preach holiness with one hand and hit with the other? The hypocrisy wasn't just in his father. It ran deeper. Mike, his older cousin, returned from the Vietnam War. Mike, like his father, was viewed as a hero, a soldier. He wore medals, and pay was greeted with respect. But to Richard, Mike revealed another truth. He proudly showed photos of decapitated bodies, bragged about raping Vietnamese women, and told stories of killing without remorse. And Richard didn't flinch. He absorbed. Because it all made sense. This was exactly like his father: honor on the outside, horror behind closed doors. That's when an idea took hold. A foundational belief in the developing mind of a disturbed young boy. Glory and sin aren't enemies. In Richard's worldview, the men who held the most power, the ones people respected, were also the most dangerous. To be a man, hero, to be remembered, you had to dominate. And if that meant hurting people, so be it. Criminal psychology, moral distortion through modeled contradiction. When a child's understanding of right and wrong becomes inverted by the actions of authority figures. What society called evil, Richard now saw as necessary, even righteous. From cross to chaos. By the time Richard Ramirez reached adolescence, the moral and spiritual confusion that had surrounded his childhood began to calcify to something darker. The boy who once served as an altar boy, obedient, quiet, with his hands folded in prayer, started to question everything the church represented. The beatings at home, the hypocrisy of his father, the war stories from his cousin. They all painted a grim portrait of the world that didn't align with sermons of peace, forgiveness, and divine justice. To Richard, God felt absent, indifferent. He had cried to heaven as a child, but no salvation came. Around the age of 13, Richard began spending long hours wandering the local cemeteries. He claimed it was peaceful there, a strange kind of refuge. But it wasn't he was seeking, it was power. Or at least, the illusion of it. Surrounded by the dead, he felt connected to something ancient, raw, and honest. The silence of the graveyard didn't lie like the whispers in church. Soon after, Richard became fascinated with the occult. He started reading about Satanism, not just as rebellion, but as a belief system where darkness wasn't denied, it was embraced. Unlike Christianity, which demanded restraint and submission, Satanism told him, "You are your own God. Take what you want. There is no guilt." This wasn't just spiritual drift. It was a deliberate inversion he had been taught. And for Richard Ramirez, it felt like finally telling the truth. The Night Stalker. On the night of June 28, 1984, Richard Ramirez committed his first known murder. The victim was 79-year-old Jenny Vinco, living on an apartment in Glass Hill Park, Los Angeles. Ramirez broke into her home through an unlocked window. He found Jenny asleep in her bed. Without hesitation, he stabbed her repeatedly, and then slit her throat so deeply, she was nearly decapitated. After killing her, Ramirez sexually assaulted her lifeless body. Then he calmly walked out, leaving the apartment soaked in blood. There was no sign of forced entry, no valuables stolen, no clear motive, just violence, just death. Police described the scene as pure savagery. But they had no leads, no suspects, and no idea that this was only the beginning of a killing spree that would soon paralyze the entire state of California in fear. March 17, 1985, Rosemead, California. It had been almost 9 months since the murder of Jenny Vinco. No suspects, no arrests, no answers. But Richard Ramirez hadn't stopped. He was only getting better. That night, Maria Hernandez, a 22-year-old woman, pulled her car to the garage of her townhome. As she stepped out, Ramirez appeared in front of her, gun in hand. He raised it and fired at her face. By sheer luck, Maria had her car keys in her hand. The bullet ricocheted off them. She fell, played dead. Ramirez walked past her and into the house. Inside was her roommate, 34-year-old Dale Okazaki. Dale heard the noise and ducked behind the kitchen counter. She tried to hide. It didn't matter. Richard spotted her head peeking up for a second. One shot. Straight to the forehead. Instant death. When he walked back out, Maria was still lying on the ground, frozen in fear. He stared at her, then turned, and disappeared into the night. Dale Okazaki was the first confirmed victim in a new wave of killings. The brutality was still there, but now it was faster, more controlled. Ramirez was evolving. He was learning to kill and vanish without leaving a trace. The Night Stalker had returned. In the case of Dale Okazaki, Richard Ramirez not commit sexual assault. It was one of the rare instances where he killed without engaging in any form of sexual violence. But that restraint didn't last long. Less than an hour later, on the very same night, he struck again. This time, the victim was 30-year-old Leon Veronica Yu. She was driving alone when Ramirez forced her off the road, dragged her from the car, and into a patch of darkness. There, he raped her, then shot her dead and vanished before anyone knew she was gone. March 27, 1985. Just 10 days after the Rosemead attacks, Richard Ramirez struck again, this time in Whittier, California. He broke into the home of Vincent Cesara, 64, and his wife Maxine, 4, in the middle of the night. Vincent was asleep on the couch. Ramirez shot him in the head at close range, killing him instantly. Then he turned to Maxine. She had heard the gunshot. She was terrified. But she wasn't helpless. Maxine managed to grab a shotgun from under the bed. But Ramirez was furious. He tackled her, beat her, bound her hands, demanded to know where the valuables were. She told him. He ransacked the bedroom. Then he came back, and that's when the true horror began. Ramirez raped Maxine. Then, before leaving, he grabbed a carving knife from the kitchen, and he mutilated her. He stabbed her multiple times. In the chest, stomach, and pubic area. Then, in an act so depraved it shocked even the most hardened investigators, he gouged out her eyes and placed them in a jewelry box. He took the box with him. It wasn't just murder. It wasn't just assault. Symbolic, a message. Not to the world, but to himself. A trophy. When the police arrived, they found a scene straight out of a nightmare. Blood everywhere. Bodies destroyed. A woman's face disfigured beyond recognition. This was the moment detectives realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary killer. They were hunting something else entirely. It was 1985. Los Angeles was on edge. But this time, the Night Stalker didn't target a couple, or an elderly woman, or someone asleep in their bed. He went after a child. 8-year-old Anastasia Hronis was asleep in her room when Richard Ramirez broke into her family's home. He avoided the adults, crept into her bedroom, and quietly lifted her from her bed. No sound, no struggle. He carried her out like a shadow. He drove her to an abandoned house. A dark, empty space that smelled of rot and dust. Over the next several hours he sexually assaulted her. Anastasia was terrified. But she kept eyes open. And in that moment, staring up at her attacker, she saw something unexpected. Fear. Not her own, his. She would later say that Ramirez looked almost haunted. His hands were violent, but his eyes were confused, shaking. As if, for a second, he realized what he was doing. As if a small piece of him still knew it was wrong. But didn't stop. Because to Richard, these crimes weren't just about lust or power. They were part of a belief, a twisted faith. He had come to see himself as a servant of Satan. And every act of pain was a ritual. Every scream a prayer. After the assault, he didn't kill her. He didn't even threaten her. He took Anastasia back home. He dropped her off, told her not to say a word, and disappeared into the night like a ghost. But she did speak. She told her parents. She told the police. And her memory would become a key part of the investigation. The hunt for the Night Stalker. By the summer of 1985, panic had spread across California. People were locking windows for the first time in years. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts, motion lights, and guns. No one felt safe. Not the poor, not even children. The media had a name for him now. The Night Stalker. But for police, the fear was matched by frustration. The murders were chaotic, random. The victims ranged from 9 to 83 years old. Some were raped, some were simply slaughtered and left behind. There was no clear pattern. No connection. Just violence. Detectives from Los Angeles, San Francisco, and neighboring counties were sitting on piles of case files, all containing horror stories with one common thread. There was no call, the mistakes started. On one night, Ramirez attempted to break into the home of 30-year-old Bill Carnes and his girlfriend, Inez Erickson. Bill was shot in the head, but survived. Inez was assaulted but managed to get a look at him. Up close, she described him as tall, thin, with bad teeth and wild eyes. And, crucially, she saw the car he was driving, an orange Toyota station wagon. Police issued an alert. But that wasn't all. At multiple crime scenes, investigators had begun to notice the same distinctive footprint. A rare Avias sneaker, size 011. It wasn't sold widely in California. In fact, only one pair of that model had been sold in the entire LA area. The tread matched impressions left in blood, in dirt, and even on victims' bedsheets. Now they had a profile. A man of Mexican descent, tall and skinny, long curly hair, decaying teeth, and a specific brand of shoe that practically screamed guilt. The fall of the fallen. The investigation had gathered momentum. Thanks to the description from Inez and the crucial evidence left behind at the crime scenes, police were starting to connect the dots. But it wasn't until the police found a solid lead that the walls truly started closing in on it. A breakthrough came when a witness, who had seen Ramirez's car parked in the area of one of the crime scenes, was able to provide a description of the vehicle that led investigators to trace the car back to a man named Richard Ramirez. Then, the final piece of the puzzle. Ramirez had been spotted in a neighborhood in East Los Angeles, walking around, looking like any other man. But for those who had been following the case, the description of his clothes, his teeth, his signature sneath, his wild eyes matched the composite sketches police had released to the media. The next step was swift. On August 31, 1985, Ramirez was walking through the streets of East Los Angeles when he was recognized by a group of local residents who had seen his face on television. They approached him. One of them grabbed him and said, "You're the Night Stalker." Ramirez tried to run, but the community turned against him. The residents chased him down, pinned him to the ground, and began beating him. Soon, police arrived and arrested him. He was taken into custody, still dazed, his stained with blood. He was finally caught. But it wasn't just his arrest that shocked the world. It was what they discovered once they got him into custody. The police found a detailed map of his crimes, and in his possession, they discovered items stolen from victims: jewelry, watches, personal belongings. But the most chilling evidence found in his confession. Ramirez told investigators he was driven by a belief in Satan, claiming that his killing spree was part of an effort to preserve that remorse. He had no remorse. In 1989, Richard Ramirez stood trial for 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 rapes, and 14 burglaries. The trial was a media frenzy. The world watched as Ramirez sat in court, showing little emotion, sometimes even smiling at his supporters, the ones who believed in his twisted cause. His defense tried to argue he was insane, but the evidence was overwhelming. Ramirez was convicted on all counts. The sentence was clear death. But Richard Ramirez never faced execution. He was sentenced to death row at San Quentin State Prison. There he stayed, his case going through years of legal appeals, but never finding a way out. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, died on June 7, 2013, from complications of B-cell lymphoma. He had spent over 23 years on death row before his death. Richard Ramirez's reign of terror ended with his capture, but the damage he caused can never be undone. The victims, their families, the communities he terrorized live with the scars of his actions every day. Yet, the haunting question remains: how does someone like Richard Ramirez come to be? And what can we learn from his twisted journey? Ramirez once said, "Serial killers do, on a small scale, what governments do on a large one. They are products of our times, and these are bloodthirsty times." In these words, Ramirez drew an unsettling parallel between his crimes and the broader violence in the world. His justification was that he, like other forces in power, was simply a product of the violent age he lived in. This perspective paints action as something almost inevitable, a response to the times, an outlet for the dark impulses nurtured in the shadows of society. Ramirez's view on the act of killing was also chillingly blunt. Killing is killing whether done for duty, profit, or fun. This statement reflects his moral distortion. To him, murder wasn't acte de force, it was simply an act. It was a way of asserting power, of feeling in control. The reasons behind the killing were irrelevant to him. Whether for a cause or out of pure pleasure, he had normalized violence in a way that made it indistinguishable in his mind. In another disturbing moment, Ramirez questioned nature itself. We are all evil in some form or another, are we not? This quote embodies the heart of his rationalization. His belief that everyone harbored darkness, and that his actions, however extreme, were no different from the inherent evil in others. It's a chilling thought. Are we all capable of the same things if pushed far enough? Ramirez's words invite uncomfortable introspection about human nature. pushing us to confront our own capacity for violence, however hidden or suppressed. Richard Ramirez's crimes serve as a grim reminder of what happens when someone loses all sense of morality, when a person's distorted belief becomes their justification for violence. The lesson here is not just to fear the monsters that walk among us, but to be vigilant in examining our own beliefs and actions. For sometimes, evil can be disguised as righteousness, or worse, as a warped form of liberation. The real question we must face now is, how do we next monster from emerging?